I have been buried beneath Stormwind's cobblestones for 3 years, 7 months, and 12 days, and the Alliance simply pretends the screaming has stopped. The iron gate sealed behind me with a sound like breaking loyalties, and I knew then that I would never again see the pale light filtering through the Canal District's merchant stalls above. The guards did not speak my crimes aloud because they had already been categorized, processed, and filed away in ledgers that transformed citizens into inventory. Here in the bowels of the stockades, justice is not about rehabilitation or punishment, but about the efficient management of problems that threaten the kingdom's carefully maintained illusion of order and prosperity. The descent into the stockades begins not with dramatic fanfare, but with bureaucratic efficiency that would make any imperial administrator proud. They process you at street level, in a nondescript building wedged between a fish merchant's stall and a cloth vendor's shop, where the cheerful bustle of commerce masks the steady flow of citizens disappearing into Stormwind's digestive system. The intake officer, a thin man whose spectacles reflect torchlight like the eyes of some nocturnal creature, records your details with mechanical precision. Name, crime, estimated duration of containment, probability of rehabilitation, economic value of continued existence. The quill scratches against parchment with the sound of wings against stone, and each stroke transforms you from a person with a history into a number with a projected lifespan. The entrance to the actual prison complex lies 23 steps below the city's foundation, accessed through a reinforced door that bears no marking, save a small brass plate reading Municipal Storage Facility, authorization required. This deliberate mislabeling serves multiple functions within Stormwind's administrative architecture. Citizens walking past assume it houses surplus grain or outdated military equipment, not the steady accumulation of individuals whose existence has become inconvenient to the kingdom's smooth operation. The guards who escort you down those steps have learned to think of themselves as warehouse supervisors rather than jailers, a mental adjustment that makes their daily duties more palatable and reduces the likelihood of uncomfortable questions about the nature of their work. The corridor that leads from the entrance extends 47 meters into the city's bedrock, carved from the same stone that supports Stormwind's cathedral and palace above. The walls weep constantly with moisture seeping through from the canal system, creating dark stains that map territories of perpetual dampness and gradual decay. This moisture serves a function beyond mere atmospheric discomfort. It weakens the mortar between stones, making escape attempts through wall excavation virtually impossible, while simultaneously encouraging the growth of molds and fungi that compromise respiratory health and reduce long-term medical costs associated with prisoner maintenance. The ceiling arches precisely 2 meters and 30 centimeters above the floor, high enough to prevent the sensation of being buried alive, but low enough to create a persistent psychological pressure that reminds inmates of their subterranean status. Torches mounted in iron sconces provide the only illumination, their flames fed by a carefully calculated mixture of animal fat and alchemical compounds that produces light sufficient for navigation, but inadequate for detailed work or extended reading. This lighting serves multiple security functions while appearing to be simple resource management. The dim conditions make it difficult for prisoners to communicate through written messages, prevent the creation of detailed maps or escape plans, and gradually damage eyesight in ways that reduce the effectiveness of any future attempts at resistance or rebellion. The torches never burn out completely, maintaining just enough light to prevent total sensory deprivation, while creating shadows that move and shift in ways that keep inmates perpetually uncertain about what they might be seeing at the edges of their vision. The cell assignment process follows protocols developed through decades of experimentation with different approaches to prisoner management and social control. New arrivals undergo medical examination by a prison physician whose training focuses on determining work capacity rather than treating illness or injury. This evaluation assigns each prisoner to one of 7 categories based on physical capability, estimated lifespan, potential for violent resistance, likelihood of escape attempts, value as a source of information, susceptibility to various forms of psychological pressure, and compatibility with existing cellmates. The resulting classification determines not only cell placement, but also food rations, work assignments, visiting privileges if any exist, and the priority level for medical attention should health problems develop during incarceration. Individual cells measure exactly 2 meters wide, 3 meters deep, and 2 meters 40 centimeters high. Dimensions calculated to provide the minimum space necessary for basic human functions, while maximizing the number of inmates that can be housed within the available underground area. The walls consist of fitted stone blocks sealed with mortar that contains ground glass and metal filings, making tunnel excavation extremely difficult and painful to attempt. A narrow slot near the floor, 12 centimeters wide and 4 centimeters high, allows guards to deliver food without opening cell doors or engaging in direct contact with prisoners. A second slot at eye level, slightly larger at 15 centimeters by 6 centimeters, permits observation and limited communication, while maintaining security barriers that protect guards from potential attacks or contamination by disease or seditious ideas. The sleeping platform attached to each cell's back wall extends 1 meter 80 centimeters in length and 60 centimeters in width, providing a surface slightly smaller than the average adult human body requires for comfortable rest. This calculated inadequacy serves multiple functions within the prison's operational philosophy. Chronic sleep deprivation reduces cognitive capacity and makes complex planning or coordination more difficult. Physical discomfort creates a constant low-level stress that makes prisoners more susceptible to suggestion and less likely to engage in rebellious behavior. The metal construction conducts heat away from the body during cold months and becomes uncomfortably warm during summer, ensuring that no season provides relief from the basic discomfort of existence within the system. Personal possessions upon arrival are catalogued, evaluated for security risks, and either confiscated permanently or stored in a repository that prisoners never see again. The uniform provided consists of rough brown cloth, cut from reclaimed fabric that still carries traces of its previous owner's experiences. The color serves practical and psychological functions, making escapees easily identifiable while reinforcing the institutional erasure of individual identity and personal history. The fabric's texture deliberately irritates the skin, creating a constant reminder of imprisonment that becomes part of the background sensation of daily existence. Prisoners quickly learn that adaptation to this discomfort represents their first step toward the psychological modifications that the system requires for efficient operation. Food delivery occurs twice daily, according to a schedule that varies unpredictably between 14 and 18 hours apart, preventing prisoners from establishing reliable temporal landmarks that might support planning or coordination activities. The nutritional paste delivered through the floor slot contains proteins derived from recycled organic waste, synthetic vitamins calculated to prevent deficiency diseases that would require medical intervention, and chemical additives that promote docility while maintaining work capacity. The taste and texture change slightly from day to day, not due to variation in ingredients, but because of deliberate additives designed to prevent adaptation and maintain a constant low-level aversion to the act of eating. This psychological association between sustenance and unpleasantness gradually undermines the basic human satisfaction derived from meeting physical needs. Guard training emphasizes the conceptual framework that transforms prisoner management from a human interaction into a technical procedure involving the maintenance of equipment. New guards undergo 6 weeks of instruction that includes detailed lessons on viewing inmates as components within a larger system, rather than individuals with personal histories or futures. This training covers proper techniques for observing prisoners without establishing eye contact or other forms of personal connection, methods for delivering instructions in ways that reinforce hierarchical relationships while minimizing opportunities for dialogue or negotiation, and protocols for reporting behavioral anomalies that might indicate developing problems with specific units of human inventory. Guards learn to discuss prisoners using language borrowed from equipment maintenance and livestock management, referring to feeding schedules, performance metrics, operational efficiency, and disposal procedures. The patrol schedule follows a pattern designed to create predictability for administrative purposes while maintaining uncertainty for prisoners attempting to track guard movements. Corridors are monitored every 8 minutes and 43 seconds during daylight hours, and every 12 minutes and 17 seconds during periods designated as night. Although the absence of natural light makes these temporal divisions arbitrary and psychologically disorienting. Guards wear soft-soled boots that minimize noise during movement, allowing them to observe prisoner activities without providing auditory cues about their location or timing. This acoustic uncertainty prevents inmates from developing reliable patterns for private communication or coordinated action, while maintaining the constant psychological pressure of potential observation. Record-keeping procedures document every aspect of prisoner existence in ledgers that transform human experience into statistical data suitable for administrative analysis and resource allocation planning. Daily reports include food consumption rates, sleep duration estimates, verbal communications overheard during observation periods, physical condition assessments, behavioral compliance ratings, and productivity measurements for any work assignments. These records serve multiple functions beyond simple monitoring, creating documentation that justifies budget allocations, provides data for improving system efficiency, and establishes legal protection for administrators should questions arise about treatment of specific individuals or general institutional practices. The transformation of lived experience into numerical data represents the final stage in the process of converting citizens into inventory. The broader purpose of the stockades becomes clear through observation of how it functions within Stormwind's social and economic systems, rather than serving primarily as punishment or rehabilitation. The prison operates as a processing facility that removes problematic individuals from circulation while extracting maximum value from their continued existence. This extraction includes not only direct labor performed by prisoners, but also the economic activity generated by construction, maintenance, guard employment, food production, administrative oversight, and the various industries that supply equipment and services to the institutional complex. The hidden nature of the facility allows citizens to support these activities without confronting the human cost of their kingdom's stability and prosperity. The psychological architecture of the stockades extends beyond its physical design to encompass the systematic modification of human consciousness in ways that serve institutional goals. The combination of sensory deprivation, nutritional manipulation, sleep disruption, social isolation, and constant uncertainty gradually erodes the mental frameworks that support individual identity and autonomous decision-making. This process transforms prisoners from potential threats to social order, into compliant resources that can be managed with minimal supervision and deployed for various purposes as the kingdom's needs require. The efficiency of this transformation depends not on dramatic intervention, but on the accumulated effect of countless small discomforts and restrictions that slowly reshape human psychology in predictable and manageable ways. Life within the stockades operates according to principles that mirror the surface world's social hierarchies, while amplifying their most brutal aspects through the concentrated pressure of confinement and desperation. The ecosystem that develops among prisoners represents not chaos or anarchy, but rather a highly organized alternative society that emerges when traditional legal structures are removed, but human nature remains unchanged. Understanding this internal order requires recognizing that the absence of official authority does not eliminate the need for authority itself, but simply allows it to be claimed by those most willing and able to exercise violence in service of their personal vision of how power should be distributed and maintained. Targor the Dread established himself as the apex predator within this underground hierarchy through a combination of physical intimidation, strategic intelligence, and an almost artistic approach to violence that served both practical and psychological functions. His reputation preceded his arrival at the stockades, carried in whispered stories told by guards who had transported other prisoners from the Red Ridge Mountains, where his work as supreme executioner for the Blackrock clan had left impressions that transcended cultural and factional boundaries. The orcs spoke of him with pride, humans with terror, and the few dwarves who had encountered his methods with a professional appreciation for craftsmanship that they normally reserved for discussions of metalwork or engineering projects. His cell, located in the northeastern section of the prison complex, became the center of an informal court where disputes were brought for resolution and alliances were negotiated through rituals that combined orcish military tradition with the pragmatic necessities of underground survival. Targor held audiences every third day during the period between afternoon and evening food distributions, receiving visitors who approached with the careful deference typically reserved for nobility or powerful merchants. These meetings followed protocols that he had developed through observation of how power operated in the surface world, adapted to the constraints and opportunities presented by prison architecture and the limited resources available for ceremony and display. The tribute system that developed around Targor's authority demonstrated the remarkable speed with which economic structures emerge, even in environments designed to eliminate traditional forms of wealth and property. Prisoners offered portions of their food rations, items crafted from scavenged materials, information about guard movements or institutional policies, and various forms of personal service in exchange for protection from other inmates, assistance in resolving conflicts, access to better sleeping arrangements, and the psychological comfort that comes from association with recognized power. This economy operated through credit arrangements and future obligations that created networks of interdependence extending throughout the prison population and connecting individuals who might never have direct contact with each other. Daily survival within this ecosystem required constant attention to social dynamics that shifted with the subtle complexity of weather patterns or tidal movements. Meal times became opportunities for negotiation and display, as the simple act of consuming the institutional food paste provided occasions for demonstrating allegiance, challenging authority, sharing resources, gathering intelligence, and maintaining the complex web of relationships that determined individual safety and access to whatever comforts could be extracted from the harsh environment. The unspoken rules governing these interactions had evolved through trial and error over the months since the last major reorganization of the prison hierarchy, and violations carried consequences that range from social isolation to physical punishment administered by inmate enforcers operating under the authority of recognized leaders. Dextran Ward occupied a different ecological niche within the prison's social structure, serving as the primary connection between the stockades and the criminal networks operating in Stormwind's underworld. His background as a former city guard provided him with detailed knowledge of law enforcement procedures, patrol schedules, communication protocols, and the personal weaknesses of individual officers that made him invaluable to prisoners planning escapes or seeking to maintain contact with associates in the surface world. Unlike Targor's straightforward approach to power through physical dominance, Ward operated through information brokerage and the careful cultivation of relationships that extended beyond the prison walls into the broader criminal ecosystem of the kingdom. His cell had been modified through careful work performed during guard shift changes to include hidden compartments where messages, small tools, and contraband items could be stored safely during inspections and searches. These modifications represented weeks of patient labor, performed with improvised tools crafted from food utensils, clothing elements, and small pieces of stone or metal carefully collected from maintenance areas and construction debris. The engineering required for this work demonstrated the remarkable ingenuity that emerges when intelligent individuals are provided with strong motivation and unlimited time to solve technical problems, even when working with severely limited resources and under constant threat of discovery and punishment. Ward's network of information exchange operated through a communication system that utilized the prison's architectural features in ways that the original designers had never anticipated. Sound traveled through the ventilation shafts in predictable patterns that allowed for coded conversations between distant cells, while visual signals could be transmitted through the strategic placement of small objects visible through cell slots or during corridor movement. Guard schedules were tracked and analyzed to identify periods of reduced surveillance, and the personal habits of individual officers were catalogued to predict behavior and identify opportunities for covert activity. This intelligence network provided early warning of planned searches, information about new arrivals and their backgrounds, and coordination capabilities that enabled group actions despite the physical separation imposed by individual cell confinement. The relationship between Ward and the prison administration represented a complex arrangement that benefited both parties, while officially violating the institutional policies that governed prisoner treatment and security procedures. Certain guards supplemented their modest salaries by providing Ward with information about upcoming policy changes, personnel transfers, and administrative decisions that affected prisoner welfare or security arrangements. In exchange, Ward ensured that information about guard corruption or incompetence did not reach supervisory personnel, and he provided intelligence about potential escape attempts or violence that might threaten officer safety or damage institutional reputation. This symbiotic corruption operated through carefully maintained boundaries that protected both sides from exposure, while allowing each to extract maximum benefit from their position within the system. Guards who participated in these arrangements learned to provide just enough genuine information to maintain their value as sources, while avoiding revelations that might seriously compromise security or result in administrative attention that could expose their activities. Ward, meanwhile, developed sophisticated methods for verifying information provided by guards and cross-referencing it with intelligence gathered through prisoner sources to ensure accuracy and identify attempts at manipulation or entrapment by institutional authorities. Brugal Iron Knuckle represented the most mysterious element within the prison's social ecosystem, a figure whose very presence challenged the administrative assumptions underlying the entire detention system. His absence from official records suggested either clerical incompetence on a remarkable scale, or the existence of parallel detention systems that operated outside normal institutional oversight and accountability. Prisoners who had encountered him in other facilities spoke of similar absences from documentation, as if he existed in the spaces between official categories and could move through the criminal justice system without leaving traces that administrators could track or analyze. His reputation rested not on dramatic displays of violence or complex political arrangements, but on an almost supernatural ability to acquire resources and information that should have been impossible to obtain within the constraints of the prison environment. Food appeared in his cell that bore no resemblance to the standard institutional rations. Tools materialized that showed signs of recent manufacture rather than improvised construction, and clothing items replaced his standard uniform periodically without any apparent source or explanation. These acquisitions suggested connections to supply networks that operated completely outside the known structure of guard corruption or prisoner cooperation. Other inmates approached Iron Knuckle with the cautious respect typically reserved for individuals whose capabilities could not be easily categorized or predicted. His willingness to share resources was balanced by an unpredictability that made long-term planning around his behavior extremely difficult. Prisoners learned to appreciate his generosity, while avoiding any dependence that might prove problematic if his situation changed suddenly or his attention shifted to other priorities. This balance created a social dynamic that benefited from his presence while acknowledging the fundamental uncertainty that surrounded his methods and motivations. The temporal distortion created by underground confinement affected different prisoners in ways that revealed the hidden assumptions underlying normal human consciousness and social organization. Without access to natural light cycles, seasonal changes, or the rhythmic patterns of surface world activity, inmates developed highly personalized approaches to marking time and maintaining psychological orientation within the endless uniformity of institutional routine. Some counted meals or guard patrols with obsessive precision, creating elaborate mental calendars that tracked days, weeks, and months through accumulating numerical sequences that became the foundation for larger calculations about sentence duration and potential release dates. Others abandoned precise temporal tracking in favor of psychological landmarks based on significant events, personal relationships, or internal emotional states that provided subjective rather than objective measures of duration and change. These approaches often proved more psychologically sustainable than mathematical precision, as they allowed for adaptation to the unpredictable variations in routine that characterized institutional life, while maintaining a sense of personal agency and meaningful progression through lived experience, rather than abstract numerical measurement. The work details available within the stockade served multiple functions that extended beyond simple labor extraction to encompass prisoner management, social organization, and the maintenance of institutional control through structured activity and carefully managed privilege distribution. Kitchen duties provided access to additional food and opportunities for resource acquisition that made these assignments highly sought after and politically significant within the prisoner hierarchy. Maintenance work offered mobility throughout the facility and exposure to architectural details that could support escape planning, while also providing access to tools and materials that could be adapted for other purposes through patient modification and strategic concealment. Cleaning assignments created opportunities for gathering intelligence about administrative activities and guard behavior, while allowing prisoners to move through areas normally restricted during cell confinement periods. These work details functioned as rewards for cooperative behavior and punishment assignments for individuals who had violated institutional rules or challenged authority in ways that required correction, but did not justify more severe responses. The allocation of work assignments therefore became another mechanism through which social control was exercised, and prisoner hierarchies were reinforced through official institutional recognition and resource distribution. Communication networks within the prison operated through multiple channels that utilized every available medium for information transmission and social connection. Verbal communication during work details and corridor movement provided opportunities for direct conversation and the exchange of detailed information that could not be effectively transmitted through more covert channels. Written messages created through improvised materials and concealed in locations that guards rarely inspected allowed for complex planning and coordination that required permanent records and careful documentation. Visual signals transmitted through clothing arrangements, cell decoration, and the strategic placement of objects visible during observation periods enabled rapid communication of simple information across long distances and through barriers that prevented other forms of contact. Physical tokens passed between individuals during work assignments or corridor encounters carried coded meanings that allowed for sophisticated coordination without verbal or written evidence that could be intercepted and analyzed by institutional authorities. The integration of these communication methods created a comprehensive information network that operated parallel to official institutional channels while remaining largely invisible to administrative oversight. This shadow communication system enabled prisoners to maintain awareness of developments throughout the facility, coordinate responses to changing conditions, and preserve social connections that supported psychological resilience and collective identity, despite the institutional pressure toward isolation and individual compliance. The Defier's presence within the prison represented not simply the incarceration of individual criminals, but the imprisonment of an entire political and social movement that continued to operate through adapted methods and modified objectives, while maintaining its core ideological commitments and organizational structure. The Brotherhood's members within the stockades maintained contact with external leadership through communication networks that extended beyond the prison walls into the broader criminal and political underground that supported their resistance to Alliance authority and their vision of social transformation through revolutionary action. These prisoners brought to the underground environment a level of political sophistication and organizational experience that distinguished their activities from simple criminal behavior or personal survival strategies. Their approach to prison life emphasized collective action, shared resources, mutual protection, and the maintenance of ideological commitment despite the pressures and temptations that encouraged individual accommodation with institutional authority. This political dimension added complexity to the social dynamics within the prison and created opportunities for larger-scale coordination and planning that transcended the personal interests and immediate survival concerns that motivated most prisoner behavior. The gradual preparation for coordinated resistance that would eventually manifest as organized rebellion had been developing through careful cultivation of relationships, patient accumulation of resources, and systematic analysis of institutional vulnerabilities that could be exploited when conditions became favorable for decisive action. This preparation required balancing the immediate needs of daily survival with longer-term strategic objectives that might not yield benefits for months or years, but would ultimately determine whether prisoner resistance could achieve meaningful results or would simply provoke institutional retaliation that would worsen conditions for everyone involved in the attempt. The machinery of rebellion operates according to principles that most citizens never have occasion to understand, requiring months of patient preparation, careful coordination, and the gradual accumulation of seemingly insignificant advantages that can be combined into decisive action when circumstances align properly for maximum effect. The planning that preceded the Defiers' uprising within the stockades began not with dramatic speeches or passionate declarations, but with quiet conversations conducted during the 14-minute window between guard patrols, when prisoners could communicate through cell walls without fear of immediate discovery and punishment for unauthorized social interaction. Basil Thread understood that successful revolution depends not on spontaneous outrage or desperate fury, but on systematic analysis of institutional weaknesses combined with methodical preparation of human and material resources that could be deployed effectively when the moment for action finally arrived. His background as a lieutenant to Edwin Van Cleef had provided him with experience in coordinating complex operations involving multiple groups with different capabilities and competing interests, skills that translated effectively to the unique constraints and opportunities presented by underground confinement and the social dynamics that had developed among the prison population during the months preceding organized resistance. The first phase of preparation involved careful observation and documentation of guard behavior patterns, administrative routines, and the various predictable cycles that governed institutional operation and created windows of vulnerability that could be exploited by coordinated prisoner action. Thread assigned different inmates to track specific aspects of prison operation, creating a comprehensive intelligence picture that revealed the precise timing of shift changes, the routes followed during patrols, the procedures used for meal distribution and waste removal, and the communication protocols that connected the underground facility with surface world authority and coordination systems. This intelligence gathering required developing methods for sharing information between prisoners who rarely had opportunities for direct contact and who needed to communicate complex technical details without creating written records that could be discovered during cell searches or intercepted by guards who might be monitoring prisoner conversations through listening techniques or surveillance methods, not immediately apparent to the individuals being observed. The solution involved creating a coded language based on references to shared experiences and common knowledge that appeared innocuous to casual listeners, but conveyed precise tactical information to individuals who understood the system being used for communication and coordination. Guard schedules were tracked through a counting system that utilized meal timing and patrol frequency to establish precise temporal landmarks that could be verified independently by multiple observers and cross-referenced to ensure accuracy and identify any changes in routine that might indicate heightened security awareness or administrative suspicion about prisoner activities and planning. The discovery that guards followed predictable patterns during shift transitions revealed a 17-minute period every 8 hours when corridor surveillance was reduced and cell observation became irregular enough to permit coordinated movement and preparation activities that would be impossible during normal operational periods. The improvisation of weapons and tools required remarkable ingenuity applied to the limited materials available within the prison environment, transforming everyday objects into instruments capable of overcoming armed guards and defeating security measures designed to prevent exactly the kind of coordinated resistance that was being systematically planned and prepared. Food utensils were sharpened against stone surfaces until their edges could cut through cloth, leather, and flesh, with sufficient effectiveness to serve as combat weapons, despite their original design for completely peaceful purposes and their construction from materials never intended to cause injury or damage. Clothing elements were unraveled and rewoven into cordage that could be used for binding captured guards, creating improvised armor that would deflect casual blows. and constructing simple mechanical devices that could multiply human strength or extend reach in ways that provided tactical advantages during close combat situations. The metal fixtures within cells were gradually loosened through patient work performed during periods when guard observation was minimal, creating projectiles and bludgeoning weapons that could be concealed until needed, and then deployed with devastating effectiveness against opponents who expected to face unarmed prisoners rather than organized combatants equipped with purpose-built instruments of violence. The accumulation of these improvised weapons required careful coordination to ensure that their preparation and concealment did not attract administrative attention, while simultaneously building sufficient arsenal to equip the number of participants necessary for successful coordinated action against trained guards operating within familiar territory and supported by institutional resources and external reinforcement capabilities. Each cell became a small manufacturing facility where prisoners worked during the hours between evening meal distribution and morning inspection to modify available materials into tools that could serve multiple functions while remaining innocuous enough to escape detection during routine searches. Communication during the preparation phase utilized the architectural features of the prison in ways that demonstrated remarkable understanding of acoustic principles and structural engineering, despite the limited technical education possessed by most participants in the planning process. The ventilation system that connected different sections of the facility carried sound in predictable patterns that allowed for coded conversations between distant cells, while the placement of small objects in locations visible through observation slots created visual signaling systems that could transmit simple messages across corridors without requiring verbal communication that might be overheard by guards or monitored through surveillance methods. The development of coordination protocols that could function effectively during the chaos and confusion of active rebellion required extensive rehearsal and refinement through repeated practice sessions conducted under conditions that simulated as closely as possible the stress and disorientation that would characterize actual combat situations. Prisoners practiced moving silently through corridors during periods when guard patrols were elsewhere, coordinating simultaneous actions through visual signals alone, and responding to unexpected complications or failures in planned sequences without abandoning overall operational objectives or exposing other participants to unnecessary risk through panicked or uncoordinated behavior. Thread's leadership during this preparation phase demonstrated the political and organizational skills that had made him valuable to the Defias Brotherhood's operations in the surface world. Adapted to the unique requirements of underground resistance and the particular challenges posed by coordinating action among individuals whose primary shared experience was incarceration, rather than ideological commitment or long-term personal relationships. His ability to maintain morale and commitment during months of patient preparation without visible progress required constant attention to the psychological needs of participants who were risking severe punishment or death in pursuit of objectives that might prove impossible to achieve, even with perfect execution of carefully developed plans. The night chosen for the uprising had been selected through careful analysis of multiple factors that would influence the likelihood of success and the potential for coordinated action to achieve decisive results before institutional response could organize effective countermeasures. The timing coincided with a shift change that would create maximum confusion among guards, a period when administrative personnel would be absent from the facility, and weather conditions above ground that would delay external reinforcements and complicate communication between the prison and surface world authority, structures responsible for coordinating responses to security emergencies. The initial action began at precisely 23 minutes past midnight, with the simultaneous assault on guard positions in 3 different sections of the facility, creating multiple points of contact that prevented defenders from concentrating their response, while forcing them to divide their attention and resources among separate threats that required immediate response, but could not be addressed effectively without weakening defensive positions elsewhere in the complex. The coordination required for this simultaneous action had been practiced dozens of times during previous weeks, with participants memorizing precise timing sequences and backup procedures that could be implemented if primary plans failed or encountered unexpected obstacles. Targor the Dread led the assault on the northeastern guard station with characteristic brutality and tactical intelligence, using his reputation for violence to demoralize defenders while employing the improvised weapons that had been carefully positioned and concealed in advance of the operation. His approach combined psychological warfare with systematic physical elimination of resistance, creating an atmosphere of terror that served tactical purposes while satisfying his personal inclinations toward creative violence and the artistic expression of power through carefully orchestrated suffering and domination. The guards assigned to this section had been selected for their experience and reliability, but their training and preparation had focused on managing individual prisoners rather than responding to coordinated military action conducted by organized opponents operating within familiar territory and supported by detailed intelligence about defensive positions and response protocols. The speed and ferocity of Targor's assault overwhelmed their initial response and forced them into defensive positions that could not be maintained against sustained attack by multiple opponents who had prepared specifically for this engagement and who possessed no concern for their own survival beyond achieving operational objectives. Dextran Ward's simultaneous action in the central corridor system utilized his knowledge of guard communication procedures and patrol schedules to isolate defensive positions and prevent coordination between different sections of the facility during the critical early minutes when organized response might have contained the uprising before it could achieve irreversible momentum. His targets included the communication equipment that connected the underground prison with surface world authorities and the alarm systems that would alert external forces to the existence of an emergency requiring immediate intervention and reinforcement. The destruction of these communication systems had been identified as essential to operational success because it would provide the time necessary for prisoners to complete their seizure of the facility and establish defensive positions before facing counterattack by forces equipped with superior weapons and training, but lacking detailed knowledge of the underground environment and the tactical modifications that prisoners had made to familiar spaces during months of preparation and planning. Ward's technical knowledge proved invaluable in identifying the specific equipment that needed to be disabled and the methods required to ensure that damage would be complete enough to prevent rapid repair, but not so extensive as to eliminate the possibility of eventual restoration when circumstances permitted resumption of normal communication with external authorities. This balance reflected the strategic understanding that complete isolation would eventually provoke massive response that prisoners could not hope to resist, while partial communication might allow for negotiated resolution that could achieve some prisoner objectives without triggering total institutional retaliation. The third prong of the initial assault targeted the armory and equipment storage areas where guards maintained the weapons and tools necessary for maintaining institutional control and responding to emergency situations that might threaten facility security or prisoner compliance with established rules and procedures. The capture of these resources would provide prisoners with access to professional weapons and protective equipment that would dramatically improve their ability to resist counterattack and maintain control over seized areas during the extended period that might be required for achieving negotiated settlement or preparing for eventual escape from the underground complex. Bruegel Iron Knuckles' role in this phase of the operation utilized his mysterious connections and resource acquisition capabilities in ways that proved decisive, despite his general reluctance to participate directly in group activities or coordinate his actions with larger strategic planning. His contribution included weapons and tools that appeared to have been manufactured outside the prison, rather than improvised from available materials, suggesting supply networks that operated independently of the communication and coordination systems that other prisoners had developed through patient cultivation of guard corruption and information exchange. The transformation of familiar prison corridors into active battleground occurred with remarkable speed, as prisoners who had spent months in individual cells suddenly found themselves moving freely through spaces that had previously been accessible only during carefully supervised and limited work assignments or corridor transitions between different areas of the facility. This sudden spatial freedom created psychological effects that were almost as significant as the tactical advantages gained through eliminating guard control over prisoner movement and access to different sections of the complex underground structure. Cells that had served as individual isolation units became staging areas for equipment storage and tactical planning, while common areas that had been accessible only during supervised group activities were converted into command centers where coordination and communication could occur without the constraints and limitations that had characterized planning during the preparation phase. The corridors themselves were modified through the placement of improvised barriers and defensive positions that would channel counterattack forces into killing zones where numerical advantages could be neutralized through superior positioning and tactical preparation. The immediate aftermath of the successful initial assault created opportunities and challenges that required rapid adaptation of plans that had been developed for the specific requirements of coordinated attack, but which needed modification to address the different tactical and political requirements of maintaining control over captured territory, while preparing for inevitable institutional response. The transformation from offensive operations focused on seizing control to defensive operations focused on maintaining control required different skills and approaches that drew upon the varied backgrounds and experiences of the prisoner population. Thread's establishment of command authority during this transition period demonstrated political skills that extended beyond military coordination to encompass the management of competing interests and conflicting priorities among prisoners who had united temporarily for the purpose of overthrowing guard control, but who possessed different long-term objectives and different concepts of how their newly acquired power should be exercised for maximum benefit to themselves and their various factional interests. The transformation from imprisoned rebels to ruling authorities occurred with a speed that revealed the fundamental human appetite for hierarchy and control, demonstrating that revolution often represents not the elimination of oppressive systems, but merely their transfer from one group of operators to another group, whose methods may prove equally harsh, but whose legitimacy rests on recent victory rather than traditional institutional authority. Within 72 hours of successfully overthrowing guard control, the prisoners who had risked everything to escape the constraints of institutional oppression had established new forms of social organization that replicated many of the same power dynamics they had recently fought to destroy, modified only by the personal preferences and cultural backgrounds of individuals who now found themselves in positions to impose their will upon others through superior organization and strategic control of essential resources. Basil Thread's emergence as the dominant authority within the newly liberated prison complex reflected not democratic selection or collective decision-making, but rather the same combination of violence, intelligence, and political manipulation that had characterized his rise within the Defias Brotherhood's external operations. His control rested primarily on his ability to coordinate the actions of prisoners whose cooperation had been essential during the uprising, but whose continued loyalty required constant attention to their individual interests and factional allegiances. The delicate balance of maintaining unified leadership while satisfying diverse constituencies created political pressures that influenced every administrative decision and shaped the development of policies that would govern daily life within the prisoner-controlled facility. The establishment of territorial divisions within the prison complex occurred through negotiations that combined elements of diplomacy, threat, and open violence, as different groups of former inmates claimed control over specific areas based on their contributions during the uprising, their perceived ability to defend their claims against challenges from rival factions, and their strategic value within the larger defensive and organizational structure that would be required to maintain prisoner control against inevitable institutional counterattack. These territorial arrangements created administrative boundaries that determined access to resources, influenced social relationships, and established spheres of authority that often conflicted with practical requirements for coordination and mutual defense. Targor the Dread's claim to the northeastern section of the facility reflected both his personal preference for areas that provided multiple defensive positions and escape routes, and the recognition by other prisoners that his reputation for violence made direct challenge to his territorial claims extremely costly, regardless of their strategic merit or fairness, according to other possible systems for resource allocation. His administration of this territory followed principles derived from Orcish military tradition, adapted to the specific requirements of underground governance and the limited resources available for maintaining order among individuals whose primary shared experience involved resistance to authority rather than cooperation with organized leadership structures. The daily governance of this section involved regular assemblies where disputes were resolved through combat or ritualized demonstrations of strength that served both practical and ceremonial functions within the social organization that Targor had established. These assemblies provided opportunities for prisoners to petition for changes in policy or resource allocation, while simultaneously reinforcing the hierarchical relationships that maintained order and prevented the kind of factional conflicts that might weaken collective defense capabilities or provide opportunities for external forces to exploit internal divisions during any attempt to restore institutional control over the facility. Resource management within the prisoner-controlled areas required developing new systems for food distribution, water access, waste disposal, and the allocation of space and materials that had previously been administered through institutional policies designed to serve the interests of external authorities rather than the needs and preferences of the individuals actually living within the underground complex. The liberation from institutional control created opportunities for more equitable and responsive resource allocation, but it also eliminated the external supply systems and administrative expertise that had maintained basic services and infrastructure despite their obvious inadequacies and deliberate inefficiencies. Food distribution became the most contentious aspect of internal governance because the institutional supply system had been designed to provide minimal nutrition, calculated to maintain prisoner health at levels sufficient for work capacity and basic survival rather than comfort or satisfaction. The elimination of external control over food delivery created immediate shortages that required rationing systems more severe than anything imposed by the previous institutional administration. These shortages affected different territorial areas unequally, depending on their proximity to storage facilities and their ability to control access points, where food deliveries had previously been received from external suppliers. Thread's attempts to maintain centralized control over food distribution encountered resistance from territorial leaders who argued that their contributions during the uprising entitled them to autonomous control over resources within their spheres of influence. This conflict between centralized coordination and territorial autonomy created ongoing tensions that required constant negotiation and frequent demonstrations of authority to prevent fragmentation that would weaken overall defensive capabilities while potentially creating internal warfare that would consume resources and attention needed for preparation against external threats. Water access presented even more serious challenges because the underground facility depended entirely on connections to the surface world's canal system and municipal infrastructure that required technical knowledge and specialized equipment for maintenance and repair. The elimination of institutional personnel who possessed this technical expertise created vulnerabilities that could not be addressed through improvisation or the application of generalized intelligence to specific engineering problems that required specialized training and experience with particular systems and equipment. The gradual deterioration of water quality and pressure created health problems that affected productivity and morale, while requiring medical attention that exceeded the capabilities available within the prisoner population. These infrastructure failures demonstrated the hidden dependencies that connected the underground facility to external systems and revealed the extent to which successful rebellion against immediate authority did not eliminate reliance on broader social and technical networks that remained under institutional control and could be manipulated to create pressure for negotiated settlement or surrender. Waste disposal systems faced similar challenges as prisoners discovered that the successful elimination of guard control had not eliminated the basic requirements for sanitation and hygiene that prevented disease outbreaks and maintained environmental conditions suitable for human habitation. The institutional systems that had previously managed these requirements operated through connections to external processing facilities that required coordination with surface world authorities and compliance with administrative procedures that prisoners could not maintain, while simultaneously asserting independence from institutional oversight and control. The psychological effects of prolonged underground existence became more pronounced as the initial excitement and satisfaction of successful rebellion gave way to the grinding daily reality of maintaining organized society within an environment designed to serve as temporary housing for individuals whose presence was considered problematic by external authorities. The absence of natural light and seasonal variation created temporal disorientation that affected planning and decision-making, while contributing to depression and anxiety that influenced interpersonal relationships and group cohesion in ways that gradually undermined the solidarity and cooperation that had made the uprising possible. Different individuals responded to these psychological pressures through various adaptation strategies that reflected their personal backgrounds and cultural frameworks for understanding confinement and resistance. Some prisoners channeled their energy into elaborate construction projects aimed at improving living conditions and creating more comfortable and defensible spaces within the underground complex. Others focused on developing communication systems and intelligence networks that would provide early warning of external threats while maintaining connections to surface world allies and information sources. The territorial conflicts that emerged during the third week of prisoner control reflected the breakdown of the temporary unity that had characterized the immediate aftermath of successful rebellion as different groups began pursuing objectives that served their particular interests rather than collective security and welfare. These conflicts initially manifested as disputes over resource allocation and territorial boundaries, but they gradually escalated into more fundamental disagreements about governance structures, leadership authority, and long-term objectives for the prisoner community. Dextran Ward's faction advocated for establishing permanent autonomous control over the facility, while developing external alliances with criminal organizations that could provide supplies and support in exchange for services that utilize the underground location for smuggling, storage, and other activities that required concealment from institutional oversight. This approach emphasized integration with existing criminal networks rather than continued resistance to institutional authority, accepting a subordinate role within larger organizational structures in exchange for improved material conditions and reduced risk of violent suppression. The conflicts between Ward's pragmatic approach and Thread's ideological commitment to continued resistance against Alliance authority created factional divisions that affected every aspect of daily governance and resource allocation. These philosophical differences influence practical decisions about fortification construction, communication with external groups, the treatment of any institutional personnel who might be captured during future operations, and the allocation of limited resources between immediate survival needs and longer-term strategic preparation for whatever external response might eventually develop. The establishment of internal justice systems required developing procedures for resolving disputes and punishing violations of community standards without reproducing the institutional oppression that had motivated the original rebellion, while maintaining sufficient order and discipline to preserve collective security and defensive capability. The challenge of creating legitimate authority structures among individuals whose primary shared experience involved resistance to authority created ongoing tensions between democratic principles and practical requirements for rapid decision-making and unified command during emergency situations. Thread's judicial procedures borrowed elements from Defire's Brotherhood traditions, while incorporating practical adaptations required by the specific conditions and constraints of underground governance. The resulting system emphasized restoration and community service over punishment and isolation, but it retained provisions for exile or execution in cases involving serious violations of collective security or attempts to betray community interest to external authorities. These provisions reflected the recognition that maintaining prisoner control required absolute commitment from all participants, and that internal betrayal posed existential threats that justified extreme responses. The internal enforcement mechanisms developed to support these judicial procedures relied primarily on peer pressure and community sanctions, rather than specialized enforcement personnel or institutional apparatus that might recreate the hierarchical structures that had characterized the previous system. This approach proved effective for managing minor disputes and violations of social norms, but it encountered difficulties when addressing conflicts between individuals with significant personal followings or territorial authority that made community sanctions ineffective or dangerous to implement. Contact with the surface world required developing communication and supply networks that could operate despite institutional efforts to isolate the underground facility and prevent external support for prisoner resistance. These networks utilized existing criminal connections and sympathetic individuals within the broader Alliance territories who supported Defire's objectives, or who could be motivated through financial incentives to provide assistance despite the legal and political risks involved in supporting organized resistance to institutional authority. The maintenance of these external connections required constant attention to security measures that would prevent institutional infiltration or surveillance, while ensuring reliable communication and supply delivery, despite changing conditions and evolving countermeasures implemented by authorities seeking to eliminate external support for prisoner resistance. The development of coded communication systems and secure meeting procedures drew upon Defias Brotherhood expertise, while adapting to the specific requirements of coordinating between underground and surface world locations. Messages transmitted through these networks provided information about institutional response planning, political developments that might affect prisoner negotiations or resistance strategies, and coordination with external Defias operations that could provide mutual support or create diversionary actions that would limit institutional ability to concentrate resources on suppressing prisoner resistance. The intelligence received through these channels influenced internal planning and resource allocation, while providing psychological benefits through maintaining connections to the broader political movement that gave meaning and context to prisoner sacrifices and continued resistance. Supply operations conducted through external networks provided access to weapons, tools, medical supplies, and luxury items that could not be produced or improvised within the underground facility, but which significantly improved living conditions and defensive capabilities, while demonstrating to prisoners that their resistance enjoyed external support and recognition. These supply deliveries required elaborate coordination and security measures to prevent interception by institutional forces, while ensuring that materials reached their intended recipients without creating evidence that could be used to identify external supporters or compromise ongoing operations. The psychological impact of receiving external support provided motivation and morale benefits that proved essential for maintaining prisoner commitment to continued resistance, despite the hardships and risks involved in prolonged confrontation with institutional authority. The knowledge that surface world allies continued to support their objectives and recognize their sacrifices helped sustain individual motivation during periods when immediate prospects appeared discouraging and when the costs of continued resistance seemed to outweigh potential benefits. The evolution of daily life within the prisoner-controlled facility created routines and social structures that gradually normalized the extraordinary circumstances of organized resistance, while establishing cultural patterns that would influence individual and group behavior during whatever resolution might eventually emerge from the confrontation with institutional authority. These cultural developments reflected the gradual transformation of temporary emergency measures into permanent social arrangements that acquired legitimacy through practice and habit, rather than formal democratic selection or philosophical agreement about their desirability. The intervention that ultimately restored institutional control over the stockades arrived not through official military action or systematic siege warfare, but through the deployment of independent adventurers whose relationship to Alliance authority remained conveniently ambiguous and whose methods of problem resolution operated outside normal legal and administrative constraints. This approach allowed Stormwind's leadership to address the prisoner uprising without acknowledging its existence through official channels or creating documentation that might raise uncomfortable questions about institutional competence and the systematic failures that had enabled organized resistance to achieve temporary success against professional security forces operating within carefully designed defensive positions. Warden Thelwater's recruitment of these external agents represented a tacit admission that the institutional resources normally available for managing prisoner populations had proven inadequate for addressing coordinated resistance conducted by individuals whose desperation and commitment exceeded the motivation of guards whose primary interest involved collecting steady wages rather than risking their lives to preserve abstract principles of institutional authority and social order. The adventurers who accepted these assignments brought combat experience and tactical flexibility that complemented their moral detachment from the political and philosophical questions surrounding prisoner treatment and the legitimacy of institutional authority over individuals whose crimes often reflected social conditions rather than personal moral failures. The systematic elimination of revolt leaders began with Targor the Dread, whose territorial control over the northeastern section of the facility had made him the most visible and accessible target for intervention, while his reputation for violence provided clear justification for lethal response that would satisfy public expectations about appropriate consequences for individuals who threatened social stability through organized resistance to legitimate authority. The confrontation between professional adventurers equipped with superior weapons and armor and a prisoner armed with improvised tools and defensive positions created through months of patient preparation demonstrated the fundamental asymmetry that characterized all conflicts between institutional power and individual resistance. The tactical approach employed by the adventurers reflected standard methodologies for eliminating organized threats, while minimizing collateral damage to institutional property and infrastructure that would require expensive repair and reconstruction following the restoration of normal operations. Their coordination and combat effectiveness exceeded anything that prisoner defenders could match, despite their detailed knowledge of the underground environment and their desperate motivation to preserve the independence they had achieved through sacrifice and collective action during the previous months of autonomous governance. Targor's final moments revealed the psychological transformation that prolonged resistance had created within individuals whose previous experience of confinement had been characterized by isolation and individual survival rather than collective action and shared responsibility for community welfare. His death represented not simply the elimination of a dangerous criminal, but the destruction of an alternative vision of social organization that had emerged from the specific conditions and opportunities created by the temporary collapse of institutional control and the subsequent experimentation with different approaches to authority and resource allocation. Dextran Ward's elimination required more sophisticated tactical approaches because his intelligence network and communication systems had provided early warning of the adventurer intervention, while his knowledge of prison architecture and guard procedures enabled him to utilize defensive positions and escape routes that maximized his ability to evade direct confrontation while maintaining coordination with remaining resistance elements. The eventual success of the adventurer assault against his position demonstrated the limitations of intelligence and preparation when confronted by superior resources and professional combat training, applied through systematic rather than improvised tactical coordination. The destruction of Ward's communication equipment and intelligence networks eliminated the prisoner community's ability to maintain contact with external supporters while coordinating internal resistance against the restoration of institutional control. This isolation created psychological pressure that complemented the physical threat represented by continued adventurer operations while demonstrating to surviving prisoners that their brief period of autonomous governance had depended on external connections and support systems that could be severed through appropriate institutional response, rather than representing genuine independence from Alliance authority and control. Bruegel Iron Knuckles' encounter with the Restoration Forces provided the most mysterious and philosophically complex element of the intervention process, because his methods of resource acquisition and his absence from official records suggested connections to systems that operated outside normal institutional oversight and accountability. His elimination required confronting questions about the extent and nature of alternative authority structures that might exist parallel to official Alliance governance, while serving functions that institutional systems could not or would not address through normal administrative and legal procedures. The weapons and equipment discovered in Iron Knuckles' possession following his death suggested supply networks that had operated independently of both institutional procurement systems and known criminal organizations while providing resources that exceeded anything that could be improvised or acquired through corruption of individual guards or administrative personnel. This evidence indicated the existence of parallel systems that challenge fundamental assumptions about the scope and effectiveness of institutional control over underground activities and resource allocation within areas that appeared to be under complete Alliance authority and surveillance. Basil Thread's final confrontation represented the culmination of the intervention process and the ultimate test of whether prisoner resistance could maintain organizational coherence and tactical effectiveness when confronted by professional opposition equipped with superior resources and institutional support. His leadership throughout the uprising had demonstrated the political and military skills that had made him valuable to Edwin Van Cleef's operations. But the isolation and resource constraints created by the systematic elimination of his allies and supporters had gradually eroded his ability to coordinate effective resistance against increasingly overwhelming opposition. The political significance of Thread's elimination extended beyond simple criminal justice to encompass broader questions about the legitimacy of institutional authority and the appropriate methods for addressing social problems that manifested through individual criminal behavior rather than collective political action. His death represented the destruction of an alternative model of social organization that had emerged from specific conditions within the underground facility, while demonstrating the institutional capacity to suppress challenges to established authority regardless of their local effectiveness or popular support among affected populations. The restoration of guard control over the facility required implementing enhanced security measures that addressed the specific vulnerabilities and procedural failures that had enabled the prisoner uprising, while preventing future coordination and communication that might support renewed resistance efforts. These security enhancements included modification of cell architecture to eliminate hiding places and communication opportunities, increased frequency and unpredictability of patrol schedules and inspection procedures, and the installation of surveillance equipment that provided continuous monitoring capabilities rather than relying on periodic observation through manual procedures that created opportunities for covert activity and coordination. The psychological impact of restored institutional control manifested through changes in prisoner behavior that reflected both the trauma of violent suppression and the recognition that temporary success in overthrowing authority had ultimately resulted in conditions more oppressive than those that had motivated the original rebellion. The enhanced security measures and increased supervision created an environment of constant surveillance and restricted movement that eliminated most opportunities for social interaction and collective activity, while reinforcing individual isolation and dependence on institutional authority for basic survival needs and minimal comfort. Surviving participants in the uprising faced enhanced sentences and punishment assignments that served both retributive and deterrent functions, while providing examples to current and future prisoners about the consequences of organized resistance to institutional authority. These punishments included extended periods of solitary confinement, reduced food rations, elimination of work assignments that had provided opportunities for movement and social contact, and assignment to maintenance duties that involved dangerous or particularly unpleasant tasks that served institutional needs while demonstrating the futility of challenging established authority and control systems. The institutional learning process that followed the suppression of the uprising involved systematic analysis of the security failures and procedural weaknesses that had enabled prisoner coordination and successful assault against guard positions and communication systems. This analysis resulted in comprehensive revision of security protocols, staff training procedures, and facility management policies that addressed specific vulnerabilities while implementing general principles designed to prevent future coordination and collective action, regardless of the particular methods or leadership that might emerge among subsequent prisoner populations. Guard training programs were expanded to include instruction in recognizing early indicators of organized resistance, while providing enhanced tactical training for responding to coordinated prisoner action with sufficient force to suppress rebellion before it could achieve the momentum and territorial control that had characterized the Defiers uprising. These training programs emphasize the importance of maintaining psychological distance from prisoners while developing observation skills that could identify suspicious behavior and communication patterns before they could develop into serious threats to institutional security and control. Administrative procedures were modified to eliminate the communication opportunities and resource access that had enabled prisoner preparation and coordination during the months preceding the uprising. These modifications included changes in work assignment procedures that prevented prisoners from gaining detailed knowledge of facility layouts and security systems, rotation of guard assignments to prevent the development of personal relationships that might compromise professional judgment and security awareness, and implementation of random search and inspection procedures that made concealment of weapons and contraband materials significantly more difficult and risky. The cataclysm that reshaped Azeroth's landscapes and awakened elemental forces throughout the world created new challenges for the stockades that transcended the political and security concerns that had dominated institutional planning and resource allocation during the period following the suppression of prisoner resistance. The emergence of Lord Overheat and his elemental followers within the underground facility represented a threat that could not be addressed through enhanced security measures or improved guard training, because it involved forces that operated according to principles completely outside normal institutional understanding and control capabilities. The elemental invasion resulted in casualties that exceeded anything experienced during the prisoner uprising, while creating structural damage to the facility that required extensive reconstruction and modification of security systems that had been designed to contain human prisoners rather than supernatural entities capable of manipulating the fundamental forces of earth and fire. The massacre of prison personnel and prisoners alike demonstrated the vulnerability of institutional authority when confronted by threats that operated outside normal political and social frameworks and could not be managed through negotiation, deterrence, or conventional military response. The reconstruction process that followed the elemental incursion provided opportunities for implementing comprehensive facility upgrades that incorporated lessons learned from both the prisoner uprising and the supernatural invasion, while creating defensive capabilities designed to address a broader range of potential threats than had been considered during the original construction and previous security enhancements. These upgrades included magical warding systems that could detect and contain supernatural entities, enhanced communication networks that could maintain contact with external authorities during emergency situations, and structural modifications that provided better defensive positions and escape routes for institutional personnel, while limiting prisoner access to critical systems and facilities. The arrival of new prisoners, including Hogger and other individuals, whose crimes and capabilities exceeded the normal range of criminal behavior that the facility had been designed to contain, created ongoing challenges that required constant adaptation and innovation in security procedures and management approaches. Hogger's background as a leader of organized Gnoll resistance in Elwyn Forest brought military experience and tactical knowledge that made him a potentially dangerous influence among prisoners, whose previous experience had been limited to individual criminal activity rather than coordinated resistance against institutional authority and alliance control. Randolph Moloch's presence within the facility added another dimension of complexity, because his criminal activities had involved corruption and manipulation of institutional systems rather than direct violence or simple property crimes that could be managed through traditional prison security measures and behavioral control procedures. His understanding of administrative procedures and bureaucratic weaknesses created opportunities for influencing prison operations through methods that bypassed normal security measures, while remaining difficult to detect and prevent through conventional surveillance and inspection procedures. The cyclical nature of uprising and suppression that characterized the stockade's operational history revealed fundamental contradictions within the institutional approach to criminal justice and social control that could not be resolved through improved security measures or enhanced administrative procedures. Each episode of prisoner resistance emerged from conditions and grievances that remained unchanged by the violent suppression of previous rebellions, creating ongoing cycles of discontent and coordinated action that required constant vigilance and periodic intervention to maintain institutional control and prevent the development of autonomous prisoner governance that might challenge alliance authority and social order. Warden Thelwater's continued reliance on external intervention to address recurring security crises demonstrated the structural limitations of institutional authority when applied to populations whose commitment to resistance exceeded the motivation of personnel, whose primary interest involved steady employment rather than ideological commitment to maintaining social order through systematic oppression and control. The repeated recruitment of adventurers to eliminate prisoner leadership and restore institutional control created a pattern of dependency that undermined the legitimacy of official authority while acknowledging the inadequacy of normal administrative and security resources for managing the political and social problems that manifested through individual criminal behavior. The transformation of the stockades from a simple detention facility into a complex battleground where competing visions of social organization confronted each other through violence and political manipulation reflected broader tensions within Alliance society regarding the appropriate relationship between individual freedom and collective security. The underground facility served as a laboratory where these tensions could be explored and tested without direct impact on surface world populations. But the lessons learned through these experiments influenced policy decisions and social attitudes that affected the treatment of criminal behavior and political dissent throughout Alliance territories. The philosophical implications of this cyclical conflict extended beyond questions of criminal justice to encompass fundamental issues about human nature, social organization, and the conditions under which institutional authority could maintain legitimacy and effectiveness. The repeated failure of enhanced security measures and administrative reforms to prevent renewed resistance suggested that the problems addressed through imprisonment reflected social conditions rather than individual moral deficiencies, and that sustainable solutions required addressing root causes rather than simply managing symptoms through increasingly sophisticated methods of control and suppression. The economic impact of maintaining the stockades as an active conflict zone rather than a stable detention facility created resource allocation challenges that influenced broader policy decisions about criminal justice and social control throughout Stormwind and the Alliance territories. The costs associated with constant security upgrades, repeated reconstruction following violent incidents, and the regular employment of expensive external intervention forces exceeded the economic benefits normally derived from prisoner labor and the deterrent effects of visible punishment for criminal behavior. I've been buried beneath Stormwind's cobblestones for 4 years, 2 months, and 18 days, and the Alliance has perfected the art of forgetting what lies beneath their feet. The iron gates have sealed behind countless others since my time, each new arrival processed with the same bureaucratic efficiency that transforms citizens into inventory and problems into resources to be managed until disposal becomes economically optimal. The stockades continue to function exactly as designed, not as a place of punishment or rehabilitation, but as a processing facility that takes inconvenient individuals and converts them into something more useful to the kingdom's operational requirements. The cycles of rebellion and suppression that characterize this place represent not failures of the system, but evidence of its perfect functionality. Each uprising emerges from conditions that the institution deliberately maintains because resistance serves essential purposes within the broader architecture of social control. The prisoners who challenge authority provide opportunities for demonstrating the consequences of defiance while justifying expanded security measures and increased resource allocation for institutional maintenance and expansion. The truth I discovered in those underground corridors remains unchanged by the passage of time and the rotation of personnel and prisoners through the facility's endless digestive processes. The stockades succeed completely in achieving their intended purpose, which has never been justice or rehabilitation, but the efficient transformation of social problems into manageable resources that serve alliance interests until their usefulness expires and disposal becomes the most economically rational administrative decision.